What's really struck me about this administration and on foreign policy generally, and the fact that the Secretary of State has appointed 3 special envoys, and 3 very powerful ones: George Mitchell to do Arab Israel, Dennis Ross to oversee Iran, and Richard Holbrooke to do Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not only do I not fault the Secretary for doing that, I think it's a really necessary sign of the times, really, that to be Secretary of State today, you need what I would call super sub-secretaries of state. Why is that? Well, you know, I think back to when I really first started, you know, learning about foreign policy and reading about it, the days of Henry Kissinger. That was an era of grand diplomacy. It was an era of great powers. Think how easy Henry Kissinger's life was. After the 1973 war, his first big diplomatic breakthrough, the first big diplomatic breakthrough in the Middle East, was to negotiate the interim withdrawal agreements between Israel and Syria and Israel and Egypt. He had to talk to 3 people. One Egyptian pharaoh named Anwar Sadat, one powerful Syrian dictator named Hafiz Assad, and one Israeli prime minister whose party and personally was overwhelmingly powerful, Golda Meir and the Israeli Labor Party. He had to talk to 3 leaders, and once he persuaded those 3 leaders, he knew that each one could deliver their country. Flash forward to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She wants to negotiate between Israelis and Palestinians today. There's one Palestinian government in the West Bank. There's another led by Fatah, another in Gaza led by Hamas. The Hamas wing is divided between a military faction and a political faction, one of which reports to Syria and the other to Iran. So you basically have 5 different parties just with the Palestinians. Israel today is ruled by Bibi Netanyahu's Likud party, which did not get, in the last election, it got roughly 1/5 of the seats in the Israeli parliament. So you have a prime minister of Israel whose mandate extends no farther than 1/5 of the seats in the Israeli parliament. It is no wonder, therefore, that the Secretary has turned to George Mitchell to be her pre-Secretary of State in many ways, to make peace, in effect, within Israel and between the Palestinians, among the Palestinians, so she can come in one day and make peace between Israel and the Palestinians. That's the degree to which the Middle East in my life has become atomized. Israel's last 2 wars were with non-state actors: Hezbollah in Iran and Hamas in the West Bank. So the whole environment is increasingly resistant to diplomacy. Then you go to the wider theater, and basically the Secretary of State, as she plans her travels, can choose to go to countries that can't deliver or countries that won't deliver. Those are basically your choices. You can go to spend your days and weeks in Afghanistan and Pakistan, countries that basically can't deliver, whose leaders, when you ask them to pull a lever, they'll pull whatever lever you want and it will come right off in their hands. Or countries that won't deliver, Iran and North Korea. I mean, how many times will we buy this carpet from Iran and North Korea? I've literally lost track. I find, just as a columnist, I can't even write about it anymore. We've just been around this track so many times. So if Hillary Clinton is able to make some lemonade out of these lemons, that will be truly a historic diplomatic achievement. Because I think this is going to be a very inhospitable era for diplomacy. There are no more big powers who not only can deliver themselves, but their client states. We live in a world of increasingly atomized and fractionated power. third issue that's on my mind is, and the one that I'm just about to go on leave for about a month and a half to update my last book, is really the interface, the interaction between the financial crisis and the environmental crisis. I'm a firm believer, and the more I watch this, that's my phone against my, excuse me, apologize. I think when we look back on 2008, 2009, we will understand that I think it was a pivotal year. Because I think two things happened this year. I think both the market and Mother Nature hit a wall this year. Not just the market. I think Mother Nature hit a wall, and there was actually an interaction between the two. My friend Paul Gilding, who's a great Australian ecologist and writer, calls it the Great Disruption. And I think with good reason. What basically happened this year, I believe, is that we came to realize that we had created a system for raising standards of living that we could not pass on to our kids. And the system, in its simplest term, worked like this. We built more and more stores to sell more and more stuff, which triggered more and more factories in China, which were powered by more and more coal plants, which earned more and more dollars, which went to buy more and more T-bills, which were recirculated back to America to build more and more stores, to sell more and more stuff, powered by more and more factories in China, driven by more and more coal, earning more and more dollars to buy more and more T-bills, recirculated back to America. That was basically the system we had created. And I think 2008, 2009, I would argue will go down as the warning heart attack that this system was unsustainable financially and ecologically. Because both systems depended on dishonest pricing of risk. This huge credit cycle got to the size it got to, if we just use the example of AIG, by completely underestimating or mispricing risk. AIG was selling insurance on securities at prices which nowhere remotely reflected the true risk of default of those securities, and did so without setting aside the necessary reserves if those securities were to blow up as they did. So AIG is a microcosm of the problem. It privatized the profits, and it socialized all the losses. When the system was working, AIG and its shareholders earned all the profits, and when it blew up, we, the taxpayers, paid the losses. It privatized the gains and socialized the losses. We've been doing exactly the same thing with nature. We have not priced the true risk to ourselves or our kids of putting all this CO2 into the atmosphere. And as we do it, as individuals and companies, we privatize the gains. And as we do that, we will surely be socializing the risks and the costs of all that, charging it on our kids' Visa cards. Both systems depended on privatizing gains and socializing losses. And I would argue both systems hit the wall this year at the same time for the same reasons. And we will look back on 2008, 2009, I think, as I say, as the warning heart attack. I think the really big question going forward, and the one really I'm going on leave just to try to answer and think through more clearly for myself, how do you do this? What is the way? What is the system that you could use to grow standards of living? I'm a capitalist. I believe in markets. I believe in growth. And even if I didn't, people in India and China do. And so they're not going to stop. So the question is, what system can we develop that will allow more and more growth, but in a way that will be both financially and ecologically sustainable?